Hey there, ready to dive into something really important. Today we're going deep on how to create environments that are truly autism-friendly. And we're not just talking specialized spaces, think homes, schools, workplaces, the whole nine yards.
It's about recognizing that many people experience the world differently and making subtle adjustments to be more inclusive.
I was reading through the guide we're using for this deep dive, and I was surprised by how much I didn't know about sensory sensitivities. Like, did you know those buzzing fluorescent lights we all hate can actually be really painful for someone with autism?
It's true.
Hmm.
For many people on the autism spectrum, sensory input can be heightened. Imagine fluorescent lights not just as annoying, but as physically jarring. It's because they flicker at a frequency that some people are sensitive to. It's like a constant visual disruption.
Wow, I never thought about it like that. It
Yeah.
definitely makes me more aware of my own surroundings now. So,
Hmm.
how do we start creating spaces that are more sensitive to this?
Well, lighting is a big one. Natural light is best, but if you're stuck with fluorescents, using dimmable bulbs can make a big difference. Think about a time you've been in a room with harsh lighting. It's probably distracting, even if you don't have sensory sensitivities. Now imagine that feeling amplified. Giving people control over the lighting can really help.
That makes a lot of sense. I've definitely experienced that feeling of being on edge in a space with bad lighting. So, besides dimming the lights, what else can we do to minimize sensory overload?
Sound is another big factor. Just like with light, what might be a mild annoyance for some kid could be very difficult for someone with autism to process. Think about all the little sounds in a typical office keyboards, clicking phones, ringing, people chatting. Now imagine those sounds all hitting your ears with the same intensity.
It's no wonder people feel overwhelmed sometimes.
Exactly. So incorporating things like carpets or curtains that absorb sound can make a huge difference. Creating designated quiet areas where someone can retreat when they're feeling overstimulated is also really helpful. Have you ever noticed how some libraries have those little nooks where you can go to focus? It's a similar concept.
That makes sense. I do find those quiet spaces in libraries really calming. And for folks who need more immediate relief, are noise-canceling headphones helpful?
Absolutely. They give people the power to control their auditory input.
Mm.
And that's important because we're not talking about just avoiding discomfort. We're talking about creating an environment where everyone can function at their best.
It's like having your own personal volume knob for the world.
I like that analogy. And it's not just about sound and lighting. Visual clutter can also be overwhelming. Imagine trying to focus in a room with tons of posters and decorations. It's visually distracting for anyone.
Right. I've always found that having a clear and organized space helps me think more clearly.
Exactly. For people with autism, too much visual stimulation can make it difficult to process information. So keeping decorations minimal and organized can really help.
So it's about creating a sense of order and predictability.
Exactly. And speaking of predictability, clear signage with both symbols and words is essential, almost like a visual roadmap. Think about those signs you see in airports or hospitals. Clear, simple, easy to follow. Those can make a big difference in helping people navigate a space, especially if they're already feeling overwhelmed.
That makes a lot of sense, especially in environments where there's a lot going on.
Speaking of helping people navigate spaces, what about the layout of a room?
Well, open floor plans can be challenging for people who are sensitive to noise and visual distractions. It's kind of like being in a fishbowl with everything happening around you. Having designated areas for different activities with clear pathways between them can help create a sense of structure. It's like creating zones within a space.
It's about making the environment more manageable. Exactly. And when it comes to seating options are key. Some people might find traditional chairs uncomfortable, while others might need to move around to regulate their sensory input.
So things like bean bags, rocking chairs, those comfy floor cushions you see in some classrooms.
Exactly. Having a variety of seating options allows people to choose what feels best for them.
It's about giving them a sense of control over their environment, right?
Absolutely. And it's also about respecting individual needs and preferences.
Oh.
What works for one person might not work for another. It's about being mindful of those differences and being flexible.
So we've talked about creating a sensory-friendly physical space, but how do we ensure that communication and social interaction are equally inclusive?
That's a great question, and it's a really important part of creating autism-friendly environments. Let's start by acknowledging that communication can be a real challenge for many people on the spectrum.
In what way?
Well, for some processing, verbal instructions can be difficult. They might need more time to process information or might benefit from visual aids. Think about a time you've tried to follow spoken directions in a new city. Now imagine if those directions were the only way you could understand where to go.
I can see how that would be stressful.
Exactly. So using visual tools like schedules and communication boards can be really helpful. It's like giving someone a roadmap for their day or a way to express their needs without relying solely on spoken language.
So instead of just telling someone what to expect, you're showing them visually.
Precisely. And this visual representation can make a huge difference, especially for those who might find spoken language overwhelming. For example, if you're working with a child who is nonverbal, you could use a picture exchange communication system, or PECS.
Pecs?
It's basically a system where individuals use pictures to communicate their needs and wants. Imagine a board with pictures of common items or activities. The child can point to a picture to request a snack or indicate they want to play outside.
That's amazing. So even without spoken language, they can still communicate effectively. I also remember reading about social stories in the guide. Can you explain what those are and how they're used?
Of course, social stories are short narratives that describe a specific situation and provide guidance on how to navigate it. Imagine you have a child who's anxious about going to the dentist. A social story might describe the steps involved in a dental checkup, from walking into the office to sitting in the chair to getting their teeth cleaned. It might even include pictures or illustrations.
I'm starting to see how helpful these tools could be in making social situations more manageable. But what about when someone's already feeling overwhelmed? What can we do to help them regulate their emotions and sensory input?
That's where designated safe spaces come in.
So like a quiet room where someone can go to decompress.
Exactly. It could be a corner of a room, a separate quiet room, or even just a designated spot on the floor. The key is that it's a predictable, safe place where someone can go to escape sensory overload or regulate their emotions. It's like hitting the pause button when things get too intense.
That's such a powerful visual. It reminds me of how some workplaces are now incorporating meditation rooms or wellness spaces. It seems like those could serve a similar purpose.
Absolutely. And those spaces can be even more effective if they incorporate sensory tools. Think weighted blankets, fidget toys, or even just soft textured objects. These tools can provide calming sensory input and help someone regulate their nervous system.
I've heard a lot about weighted blankets lately. How do those work?
They provide something called deep pressure stimulation. It's like a gentle hug, and for many people it can have a very soothing effect.
That makes sense. And fidget toys. I imagine those can be helpful for people who need to move their bodies to regulate their sensory input.
Exactly. It's a way to release pent-up energy or provide a sense of grounding. It's important to remember that everyone's sensory needs are different. What works for one person might not work for another. The key is to offer a variety of options and let individuals choose what helps them feel calm and focused.
So it's about empowering individuals to manage their own sensory experiences.
Precisely. And it's not just about physical spaces and tools, it's about fostering a culture of understanding and acceptance. Having trained staff or supportive policies in place can make a world of difference.
What do you mean by that?
Well, for example, if you're a teacher working with a student with autism, educating yourself about the challenges they might face can help you create a more supportive classroom environment. Establishing clear routines and informing students of any upcoming changes in advance can also reduce anxiety. And encouraging patience and understanding among all students can go a long way in fostering a sense of inclusion.
It's about recognizing that everyone learns and interacts with the world differently.
Exactly. And being willing to adapt your approach to meet individual needs.
So far, we've mainly talked about homes, schools, and workplaces, but what about making public spaces more autism-friendly? Places like stores, restaurants, museums, parks.
That's a great point. It's one thing to create a sensory-friendly bubble in your own home, but what about when you're out in the world? Fortunately, there's been a growing movement towards making public spaces more inclusive.
I've noticed that some stores now offer sensory-friendly shopping hours. What does that usually involve?
They'll typically dim the lights, turn down the music, and maybe even turn off the loudspeaker announcements. It creates a calmer atmosphere for people who are sensitive to noise and visual stimulation.
That's a great initiative. I also remember reading about sensory-friendly playgrounds. What makes a playground more sensory-friendly?
Instead of the traditional swings and slides, you might see equipment that provides different sensory experiences. Things like swings that provide deep pressure textured surfaces to explore, or musical instruments that create calming sounds.
It's like designing a playground that engages all the senses in a mindful way.
Exactly. And it's not just about making adjustments for people with autism. It's about designing spaces that are accessible and enjoyable for everyone. That's where the concept of universal design comes in.
Can you tell me more about universal design?
It's a philosophy that advocates for creating environments that are usable by people of all abilities from the outset. Imagine a building with ramps instead of stairs, doorways wide enough for wheelchairs, and clear signage with both text and symbols. That's an example of universal design in action.
So instead of retroactively making adjustments for people with disabilities, you're designing inclusivity into the very fabric of the space.
Exactly. It's a proactive approach that recognizes that we all have different needs and abilities.
Hmm.
And when you design with those differences in mind, you create a more welcoming and inclusive environment for everyone.
I love that. It's like we're moving away from the idea of normal and embracing the beautiful diversity of human experience. Speaking of embracing diversity, how can we make the digital world more inclusive? I mean, we spend so much of our lives online these days.
That's such an important point. And just like physical spaces, digital spaces can also present challenges for people with autism.
Mm.
Think about all the flashing banners, autoplay videos, and pop-up ads that bombard us online.
It's like sensory overload, but in the digital realm.
Exactly. So designing websites and apps with accessibility in mind is crucial. That means using clear navigation, easy-to-read fonts, and minimal distractions.
So no more cluttered layouts or flashing neon signs.
Right. It's about creating a more calming and user-friendly experience for everyone. And just like in physical spaces, clear signage is essential. That means using clear headings, concise language, and intuitive menus. It's like creating a digital roadmap that's easy to follow.
It makes sense. If I'm struggling to navigate a website, I can usually just close the tab and move on. But for someone with sensory sensitivities, those digital distractions can be much more difficult to escape.
Exactly. And it's not just about avoiding distractions. It's also about providing alternative ways to access information. For example, captions and transcripts are essential for people who might struggle with auditory processing. And alternative text descriptions allow people who are visually impaired to hear images using screen readers.
It's about recognizing that not everyone experiences the digital world in the same way, and providing multiple ways to access information makes it more inclusive for everyone.
You got it. And just like we avoid flickering lights in physical spaces, we should avoid autoplay videos and excessive pop-ups in digital spaces. It's all about creating a more calming and user-friendly digital experience.
What's fascinating